The wedding hall shimmered with gold and laughter, the kind of place where everything sparkled except her. She sat quietly at the back corner of the room, her hands folded in her lap, watching the guests glide across the dance floor in their glittering gowns and polished suits. Her dress was clean but simple, pale and faded from too many washes, and her shoes old leather ones scuffed from years of walking to work. She hadn't meant to stand out, but in a world full of diamonds, even honesty draws. Stairs a group of bridesmaids whispered near the dessert table, their eyes darting toward her, one of them stifling a laugh. "Oh my God, look at her shoes!" Someone giggled. Another snorted. "She probably doesn't even realize this isn't a charity dinner." Laughter rippled just enough for her to hear. She lowered her head, pretending to check her phone, pretending she didn't care. But her throat ached and her hands shook. She had come because she was invited, because once the bride had been her friend. But now it felt like a mistake. When the music paused for the toasts, she tried to slip out quietly, her steps soft against the floor, until someone's voice stopped her. "Wait." The room turned toward the sound. It was the groom. He stood tall in his dark suit, glass in hand, eyes fixed on her as silence rippled through the guests. "Where are you going?" he asked gently. She froze, every pair of eyes now on her. "I was just leaving." She tried to smile, but it wavered. He shook his head. "Not yet, please." He walked across the floor, stopping beside her. The whispers rose again until he raised his voice, calm but firm. "Do you all know who she is?" The room fell silent. The bride looked confused. The bridesmaids exchanged uneasy glances. He continued, "This woman, sitting here in those old shoes, is the reason I'm standing here today." The room went utterly still, only the faint clink of a glass breaking the silence. The groom's voice softened, but carried through every corner of the hall. "You all see her. Shoes. You see the worn leather and the faded dress, but you don't see the nights she walked miles to work, just so my mother could have a home-cooked meal when we couldn't afford one." Gasps rippled across the tables. The bride blinked her mouth, parting in shock. The groom went on, steady and sure. "She was my mother's nurse when everyone else turned her away, because she couldn't pay the hospital bills. She used to arrive at dawn in the rain, carrying groceries paid for with her own money. She never once complained, not once." He looked directly at the group who had laughed earlier. "You mocked the shoes that carried her through every one of those mornings, the shoes that stood in line at the pharmacy, so my mother could live to see this day." The bridesmaids looked down at their plates, faces red with shame. The bride reached for her husband's hand, whispering softly, "I didn't know." He nodded. "That's because she never told anyone. She didn't need credit. She just gave kindness." He turned back to the woman still standing by the door, eyes glistening now. "You shouldn't be sitting in the back," he said quietly. "You should be up here with us. You helped build this day." Her lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears. "I only did what anyone would have done," he smiled. "No, you did what most people wouldn't." The guests began to rise one by one, clapping softly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the room like thunder. The applause swelled through the room, until even the "oh" band stopped playing, the sound of hands clapping, echoing off the golden walls. The woman stood frozen, her eyes glistening as the bride rose slowly from her chair, her veil trembling slightly as she walked across the floor. Every gaze followed her, steps until she reached the woman who still clutched her small purse against her chest like armor. The bride's voice was quiet, but full of emotion. "I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes soft with tears. "I was so busy trying to make everything perfect that I forgot who was real." She took the woman's hands, gently squeezing them. "You should have been sitting beside my family, not hidden in the back." The woman shook her head. "No, dear, you don't owe me anything." The bride smiled sadly. "Yes, I do. You took care of the man I love when he had nothing. You were there before the success, before the money, before the wedding, planners and the cameras." The groom stepped forward, sliding his arm gently around his bride's waist, looking at the woman with deep gratitude. "You gave us more than we can ever repay," he said quietly. Then he turned toward the guests and added, "And if anyone in this room still thinks kindness looks like luxury, they're not seeing clearly." The woman's tears finally spilled. As the bride guided her toward the main table, They cleared a chair for her right next to the couple, and as she sat down, the groom knelt slightly, adjusting her chair, saying softly, "You belong here, ma'am. Always have." The guests clapped again, this time not out of pity but out of respect. The woman looked around the room, her old shoes still scuffed, still worn, but now shining under the chandelier like they were made of gold. As dinner resumed, the air in the hall felt different, softer, lighter, touched by something true. The woman sat beside the bride and groom, still overwhelmed, her wrinkled hands folded tightly in her lap. The groom poured her a glass of water himself, a small gesture, but one that made her throat tighten. Around the table, people spoke in lower tones now, as if afraid to break the spell that had settled over them. The bride leaned closer, her voice trembling. "I remember your face," she said softly. "You came to see my husband when he was sick. You brought soup every night." The woman smiled faintly. "He hated that soup," she said with a laugh. "He always tried to pretend he liked it." The groom chuckled, his eyes shining. "I did. But it wasn't the soup that helped me, it was you." Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and unashamed. She looked at the two of them, radiant and full of life, and whispered, "That's all I ever wanted, to see him happy." At the other tables, the guests looked at her differently now. The ones who had mocked her earlier approached one by one, offering soft apologies, eyes lowered in shame. She only smiled and said the same thing to each of them. "It's all right. Just be kind next time." When the music started again, the groom stood and extended his hand. "Would you dance with me?" he asked gently. She laughed through her tears. "Me? In these shoes?" He smiled. "Those shoes have walked further than any of ours ever will." She took his hand and together they stepped onto the dance floor. The room went silent again as they moved slowly, the bride watching with her hands over her heart. The chandelier lights reflected off the floor, and for a moment it felt as if time itself had bowed to her quiet grace. The woman smiled through tears, whispering softly, "I never thought these old shoes would bring me here." The groom replied, "Maybe they were always meant to. If this story moved, you share it, so others never forget that one selfless act can rewrite a destiny in ways no one sees coming."